Jessica stood frozen as the mall guard blocked her way, voice cold and unyielding. "No service dogs allowed." Max, her loyal golden retriever, whimpered softly beside her. A lifeline denied. The air thickened with silent injustice. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. Jessica Miller's breath hitched as she stood frozen in the cold shadow of the Grand Oaks Mall entrance, the hum of weekend shoppers swirling past her like a tide she couldn't swim against. The sharp autumn air bit at her cheeks, but the sting in her chest was far deeper. Max, the golden retriever at her side, stood perfectly still, his amber eyes locked onto hers with calm reassurance. The familiar weight of his vest, bright yellow with bold lettering that spelled out "Service Dog," should have been a universal passport into any public place. But here, in this moment, it was nothing more than a flashing neon sign of rejection. Mike Henderson, the mall's head of security, loomed with rigid authority. His uniform was crisp, his posture unyielding, but his eyes lacked compassion. "No pets allowed," he repeated, the words dripping with bureaucratic finality, as if the law had been handed down from some distant, uncaring throne rather than written to protect people like Jessica. Jessica's hands clenched at her sides. "Max isn't a pet," she said, voice tight, trembling with a mixture of disbelief and rising anger. "He's my service dog. He helps me every day, with PTSD, with my balance. He's certified. You can't just refuse us like this." Mike swallowed nervously, glancing over his shoulder as if hoping a higher authority might intervene. "Management's worried about liability, complaints. It's a policy," he said, the words sounding like a hammer dropping on fragile hope. Jessica's chest constricted painfully. She had faced enemies overseas, the chaos of combat, the shattered silence of sleepless nights. But this, a uniformed guard denying her access to a place meant to serve the community, felt like a betrayal on home soil. It wasn't just a rejection, it was a refusal to see her humanity, a dismissal of the invisible battles she fought daily. Max shifted, his head tilting slightly as if to say, "I'm here. I won't leave." His steady presence grounded her, but it did little to erase the sting of humiliation. Passers-by glanced their way, some confused, others indifferent. No one stepped forward. In that moment, Jessica's mind raced back to her training in the National Guard, the oath she had taken to protect and serve. How ironic, she thought bitterly, that the very system she defended with her life could be so blind to the needs of its own. Her fingers brushed the identification papers she always carried, certificates proving Max's status, but she knew words on paper wouldn't break down a wall built on fear and ignorance. Word spread swiftly beyond the mall's sliding glass doors. Members of Jessica's National Guard unit, hearing the story through a ripple of texts and calls, felt a knot of outrage tightening in their chests. They weren't just soldiers. Many were fellow veterans, individuals who understood the invisible wounds and the vital role service animals played in healing. They saw Jessica's confrontation not as a singular incident, but as a symbol of a wider problem: disrespect toward those who had sacrificed. Captain Mark Reynolds, a close friend and commanding officer, fired off messages to the unit's group chat. The outrage was palpable, the anger mounting. "This isn't just about Jessica," he typed. "It's about every veteran who faces that door and finds it slammed shut. We can't let this stand." Others chimed in, veterans who'd seen the same dismissiveness from businesses, who'd felt the sting of exclusion masked as policy. Their stories interwove into a collective tapestry of frustration and determination. The service dog ban wasn't just ignorance, it was a refusal to acknowledge the reality of disability, the subtle scars left behind by service, and the critical lifeline these dogs provided. Back at the mall, Mike Henderson paced nervously inside his security office. The policy he enforced felt like a fortress of safety for management, but an impenetrable prison for people like Jessica. He wasn't a villain in his own mind, just a man caught between regulations and the human stories he barely understood. Fear of legal consequences and complaints weighed heavily on him, yet he sensed the growing storm his actions had unleashed. Jessica, meanwhile, stood quietly on the sidewalk outside the mall's glowing entrance, Max at her heels. Her pulse thrummed with a mix of exhaustion and rising resolve. The world had just shown her a wall she hadn't expected here, but it would not be the end. If anything, this moment was the spark, raw, painful, but alive, that would rally those around her to challenge the unseen barriers facing disabled veterans every day. Captain Mark Reynolds sat alone in the dim glow of his office, the sharp crackle of radio chatter fading into the background as his mind replayed the scene that had unsettled him more than any battlefield memory. Jessica's confrontation with Mall guard Mike Henderson wasn't a trivial policy dispute. It was a raw, unmistakable wound inflicted on those who had given so much, a silent betrayal wrapped in the guise of rules and liability fears. For Mark, the insult was personal. Every soldier, every veteran who returned home carrying invisible scars deserved dignity and unwavering respect, especially when accompanied by service dogs trained to bridge the gap between disability and independence. Mark's fingers hovered over the keyboard, thoughts coalescing into a singular mission. This injustice could not stand unchallenged. He began reaching out through familiar channels, calling on the bonds forged in shared sacrifice. Veterans groups, local service dog organizations, animal rights advocates, all were enlisted in a rallying cry that transcended mere protest. This was a demand for recognition, for the affirmation of rights too long denied or ignored. Every handler was asked to bring their dog, every supporter to bring their voice. The message was precise and unyielding. We will be seen. We will be heard. In the days leading to the demonstration, Mark watched the momentum build with a mixture of awe and urgency. Social media posts flourished, hashtags proliferated, and stories poured in from veterans who had faced similar humiliations, from families whose children depended on service animals for survival, and from advocates who understood that this fight was about far more than one mall's policy. It was about dismantling systemic barriers that crippled lives and stifled dignity. Flyers were printed, calls made, and alliances formed with local news outlets ready to spotlight the growing movement. When the day arrived, the air was charged with a palpable energy, an undercurrent of resolve tempered by the weight of collective pain. Over 200 dogs, each outfitted in official vests marked service dog, PTSD support, or mobility assistance, lined the expansive plaza outside Grand Oaks Mall. Their handlers stood tall beside them, faces etched with stories of hardship and resilience. Among the crowd were parents, elderly veterans, civilians moved by the cause, and advocates wielding banners and signs that demanded not just access, but respect. The dogs, golden retrievers, Labradors, German shepherds, and a kaleidoscope of breeds, mirrored their handlers' determination. Some sat patiently, tongues lolling with quiet calm. Others stood alert, eyes scanning the horizon for signs of opposition. The scene was as much a demonstration of unity as it was a testament to the profound bonds forged through training and trust. Each animal symbolized a lifeline, a silent partner in the fight against isolation, fear, and marginalization. Mall management, unprepared for the scale and intensity of the response, scrambled behind closed doors. Security personnel were instructed to remain passive, an uneasy truce born of surprise rather than agreement. Yet the tension was thick and suffocating, weaving through the crowd like an unseen fog. Conversations buzzed, a mixture of whispered strategizing, affirmations, and moments of raw emotion. Veterans clasped hands with strangers, tears glistening in eyes hardened by war and hardship, finding solace in shared struggle. At the forefront stood Jessica, her gaze steady despite the surge of emotion threatening to spill over. Max remained poised at her side, his warm presence a beacon of comfort and strength. The humiliation she had endured mere weeks before was replaced by a wave of belonging, an affirmation that her fight was not solitary. Around her, voices rose in unison, not in anger alone, but in an unyielding call for change. Each chant, each raised fist, echoed with the legacy of those who had fought battles overseas and now faced a different kind of war on home soil. As sunlight dipped behind the mall's glass facade, the crowd's energy did not wane. Hope, fragile yet fierce, blossomed within the gathering like a flame refusing to be extinguished. Mark's plan had evolved beyond protest. It had become a movement, a rising storm threatening to dismantle the unseen barriers that had long confined so many. And at its heart was a simple, unassailable truth. Respect for those who serve and the dogs who help carry their burdens was not a favor to be granted, but a right to be upheld. Jessica caught Mark's eye across the crowd, a silent exchange of gratitude and resolve. The battle was far from over, but in this moment, surrounded by the strength of community, the impossible suddenly seemed within reach. The march began with a quiet but resolute energy that rippled through the crowd like an undercurrent of defiance and hope. Jessica stepped forward first, Max at her side, his golden coat gleaming under the fading afternoon sun, the bright yellow service vest a beacon against the indifferent gray of the mall's concrete facade. Behind her, hundreds of handlers and their service dogs aligned with precision and pride, a living, breathing assertion of rights long ignored and marginalized. Each step forward was more than a physical movement. It was a deliberate statement, a refusal to be invisible, a challenge to the blind policies that had once barred them. The dogs moved with a dignity that spoke volumes. Their calm, measured strides contrasted sharply with the uncertainty and fear their handlers had faced when turned away. There was no chaos in this procession, only solidarity, a collective refusal to be dismissed. The vests they wore were badges of honor, emblazoned with words like service dog, PTSD support, and mobility assistance. These were not pets, but partners, lifelines woven into the daily existence of those they served. The sight was striking, a powerful tableau against the mall's cold, indifferent exterior, a visual argument for inclusion, compassion, and respect. Mike Henderson, the mall guard whose rigid enforcement of the no pets policy had ignited this movement, watched from a distance. His posture was stiff, arms crossed, but his eyes betrayed a growing turmoil. The faces before him were no longer abstract rule breakers, but real people. Veterans who bore scars invisible to the eye, children whose reliance on their dogs was a lifeline, men and women reclaiming dignity with every determined step. The weight of his initial judgment pressed heavily on him, twisting into a knot of regret and confusion. His adherence to policy had been born not from malice, but from fear, a fear of liability, complaints, and the unknown. Yet here, in this gathering, the human cost of that fear was undeniable. As the procession continued, the crowd's message grew louder, though still marked by restraint. Signs waved, voices rose in unified chants that echoed across the plaza. "Respect our rights! Service dogs save lives! No more barriers!" The sound was not angry or violent, but insistent and powerful, a chorus that refused to be ignored. Passers-by stopped, some recording on phones, others nodding in quiet solidarity, their curiosity transforming into empathy. Behind the scenes, the mall's management wrestled with a mounting crisis. The scale and visibility of the demonstration had caught them unprepared. Every attempt to push back risked deepening the backlash. With growing unease, they convened emergency meetings, consulting legal advisors and public relations experts. The writing on the wall was unmistakable. Change was not just necessary, it was inevitable. The cost of resistance, both reputational and financial, had become too high. Finally, the decision came: a public apology. In a carefully crafted statement broadcast across local news and social media, the mall acknowledged its failure to respect the rights of Jessica Miller and others who depended on service animals. The management promised immediate policy revision, comprehensive staff training, and outreach to veteran and disability organizations to ensure such incidents would never happen again. The apology was more than words. It was a concession that the old way was broken and that justice demanded accountability. News of the event spread like wildfire beyond the city limits. National media picked up the story, framing it as a pivotal moment in the ongoing struggle for veterans' rights and service dog recognition. Conversations sparked on talk shows, social media platforms, and legislative halls about the importance of accessibility, empathy, and the real-life impact of exclusionary policies. Jessica and Max became symbols of resilience, faces that humanized a complex issue, reminding the nation that behind every policy debate were people fighting daily battles both visible and invisible. For Jessica, the journey from humiliation to vindication was deeply personal. The pain of rejection remained etched in memory, but it was now transformed into a wellspring of pride and purpose. The community's embrace filled the void left by earlier isolation. Max, once simply her support, had become a symbol of hope and justice, embodying the bond that had helped her reclaim agency over her life. Mark Reynolds' words, shared at the event's close, resonated with unshakable clarity. Sometimes justice doesn't come quietly. It barks loud and clear. The statement captured the essence of their victory, that change often requires courage to confront discomfort, to speak out where silence once reigned, and to insist on dignity where prejudice sought to deny it. As the crowd dispersed, a palpable sense of transformation lingered in the air. The march was more than a protest. It was a catalyst, a ripple that would inspire countless others to stand firm against injustice in their own lives and communities. The story of Jessica, Max, and the thousands who marched beside them was a testament to the power of collective action and the unyielding demand for respect. In that moment, the unseen barriers had been shattered, not by force or fury, but by the steady, unwavering presence of those who refused to be ignored. The leash that bound Jessica and Max had become a leash of justice, tethering a community together in a fight that was far from over, but had, at last, found its voice.